Following the 1960 massacre of unarmed demonstrators at Sharpeville, near Johannesburg, South Africa, in which 69 black people were killed and over 180 were injured, the international movement to end apartheid gained white support. Widespread international support started gathering for anti-apartheid sentiment. However, Western nations were reluctant to engage in such movements. Following that, the United Nations moved to pass General Assembly Resolution 1761 in 1962, which not only condemned South Africa as violating the UN Charter and a threat to international peace and security, but also established the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid. Back then, the South African Prime Minister and architect of South Africa's apartheid policies, Hendrik Verwoerd, dismissed an Israeli vote against South African apartheid at the United Nations, saying, "Israel is not consistent in its new anti-apartheid attitude. They took Israel away from the Arabs after the Arabs lived there for 1,000 years. In that, I agree with them. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state." Verwoerd's newspaper, bear in mind, Die Transvaller, which often depicted interracial marriages and Jews in general in a horrible light, was settled as having took on a pro-Nazi stand during the Second World War by the courts twice. South African leaders have been outspoken, though, in the similarities between the two systems, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who noted, for instance, that Israel had created an apartheid reality, and that parallels to my own beloved South Africa are painfully stark indeed. Israel has always planned on delivering a Jewish majority state as opposed to a Jewish and Arab coexistence. Then Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu put it more directly. Instead of making it easier for Palestinians who want to get citizenship, we should make the process much more difficult, in order to guarantee Israel's security and a Jewish majority in Israel. As Prime Minister, he also said in 2019 that Israel is not a state for all of its citizens, but of the Jewish people exclusively. The claim of Israel being an apartheid state may seem crass or provocative, especially to those who often may see the state in a positive light. However, many claims are made according to multiple human rights organizations, including Israeli ones, United Nations ministers, and even former apartheid South African politicians and influential speakers. Their actions all align with the original goal of keeping a Jewish majority state and kicking the Arabs out, as outlined by David Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli Prime Minister, in a letter to his son in 1937, where he said, "We must expel Arabs and take their place. Up to now, all our aspirations have been based on an assumption, one that has been vindicated throughout our activities in the country." The ideal goal is to carry out steps to the native Palestinian population to make life as difficult as possible, leading them to flee the country or to temporarily retreat into less desirable areas. Once that happens, the imposed system ensures that they are never able to return.
You have lots of declassified documents, which I have in the book, showing how South African leaders, this is before apartheid fell, of course, in 1994, South African leaders and Israeli leaders admired each other. White South Africans admired what Israel was doing to Palestinians, mostly Muslims, although some Christians too. And Israel really admired what white South Africa was doing to the blacks, oppressing them, apartheid. And I show that alliance, that backing of each other's repression, was because both nations thought and argued they were fighting barbarism in their own backyard. Black population, Palestinians, and getting inspiration from each other. So Israeli leaders would go to South Africa, look at the Bantustans, where blacks were essentially herded, and say, we could do something similar with Palestinians. And to some extent, what Israel has created in Palestine is remarkably similar to that. Different, but similar. And I think the current International Court of Justice case, fast forward more than half a century, has a direct line from Israel backing apartheid South Africa to this day. And what I mean by that is that many South African leaders, including the ones who are in charge, in relation to this case, many of them said in the last months, we have not forgotten what Israel did to our people in the 70s and 80s and 90s, meaning supporting our oppressors. But I see a real strong historical line between these two events decades ago, because at the end of apartheid, Mandela said, I have the quote in the book, I'm paraphrasing, something like, we will not forget what Israel did to our people, namely backing, arming, training our oppressors.
So what is apartheid? Apartheid is a crime against humanity as set out in the 1973 International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It is defined by the UN and adopted by the International Criminal Court as inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. According to the UN, for a system to be enabling apartheid, it must practice the following steps. 1. An intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another. 2. A context of systemic oppression by the dominant group over the marginalized groups. And 3. Inhumane acts such as forcible transfer, expropriation of landed property, and creation of separate reserves and ghettos. Marginalized groups do not need to be a racial hierarchy or based off of skin tones, but can be a system based off of national or ethnic ties too. So has Israel reached the threshold required to be labelled an apartheid state? Apartheid is often seen as one of the worst crimes against humanity. Well, there has been some reporting done by several human rights groups, as well as many UN commissions. Human Rights Watch, for example, have released an almost 250-page report titled A Threshold Crossed, Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution, and I read it all, start to finish. By the way, I'd highly encourage anyone who's available to read the entire report from start to finish, as it is a brilliant piece of reporting. But should you not have the time to do so, this video has summarized the points mentioned. I also include parts of the reports from Amnesty International, B'Tselem, as well as the United Nations and other legal scholars. Since the Nakba in 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel, governments created and maintained a system of laws, policies and practices designed to oppress the native Palestinians and create Jewish superiority and majorities. If you would like to learn about the context of the Nakba, I highly encourage you to watch this previous video I made and come back to this one once you're done. It would help you understand the context more. The Israeli system plays out in different ways across the different areas where Israel exercises control over Palestinians' rights. But the intent is always the same, to privilege Jewish Israelis at the expense of Palestinians. We'll start off with, can a Jew and an Arab even be seen as a national group? Well, in Israel, the 1950 Law of Return, which guarantees Jews the right to immigrate to Israel and gain citizenship, defines Jew to include a person who was born of a Jewish mother, embracing a descent-based as opposed to purely religious classification, according to Human Rights Watch. Whereas the Palestinian Liberation Organization Charter defines Palestinians as those Arab nationals who, until 1947, normally resided in Palestine, emphasizing that the identity is transmitted from parents to children. So distinction of Arab and Jew, or Israeli and Palestinian, are to be made mutually exclusive. This offers an ethnicity-based distinction as opposed to a religious one. This means that any time a law is passed favoring only Jewish treatment, or a politician is openly calling for the boosting of only Jewish privileges or demographics, this also implies doing so at the expense of the Arab population. Well, what is Israel? The key declarative line of Israel's proclamation of independence proclaims the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. Israel's basic laws, the effective constitution, reinforce that the state is Jewish, rather than belonging to all its citizens, which is highly problematic to begin with.
Imagine for a moment, if you will, the United States in the present day. Imagine a bill reaches the U.S. House of Representatives called America, the nation-state of white people. In its basic principles, it states, the right to exercise national self-determination in the United States is unique to white people. Further down, a clause for white settlement. The state views the development of white settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. Outraged, a coalition led by the Congressional Black Caucus initiates a challenge to the bill and proposes a bill of their own, where it calls the United States a country for all its citizens. But the Speaker of the House unilaterally disqualifies the bill before it's allowed to even be debated. Why? The House General Counsel explains in a statement, the bill includes several articles that are meant to alter the character of the United States from the nation-state of white people to a state in which there is equal status from the point of view of nationality for whites and people of color. The bill is dead. America, the nation-state of white people, passes through both chambers of Congress unchallenged. It's then signed into law. U.S. President Joe Biden would invoke the law in a tweet a year later, saying, America is not a state of all its citizens. According to the nation-state law we passed, America is the nation-state of white people, and not anyone else. As one rights group put it, there is no democratic constitution in the world that designates the constitutional identity of the state on racial grounds as serving one ethnic group. There is now. This disconcerting scenario is anything but. It's completely real and happened just a few years ago to little coverage and little condemnation.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, on the 10th of March 2019, in a post on the social media platform Instagram, stated, "Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation state of the Jewish people and only them." So in order to classify Israel as an apartheid state, we'd have to find evidence of distinct differences, both in law and in practice, between the two groups, Jew and Arab in this case, intention to dominate, systemic oppression of one over the other, and inhumane acts being carried out. According to War on Want, a British charity based in London, in effect, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories constitute one territorial unit under full Israeli control. Palestinians constitute around half of the total population inside Israel and the occupied territories. Yet under Israeli law and in practice, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians are treated differently in almost every aspect of life. Housing, education, health, employment, family life, residence, and freedom of movement. Dozens of Israeli laws and policies institutionalize this prevailing system of racial discrimination and domination. To put it simply, despite maps often being shown to have separate Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza Strip as autonomous and sovereign bodies. Therefore, we will be looking both at how Israel controls the territories of East Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, as well as if and how Palestinians are discriminated against compared to Jews. According to War on Want, Israel carries out various acts that are prohibited by the UN Apartheid Convention, including forcible transfer of Palestinians to make way for illegal Israeli settlements, preventing Palestinians from returning to their homes and lands, including millions of refugees in exile, systemic and severe deprivation of fundamental human rights of Palestinians based on their identity, denying Palestinians their right to freedom and movement and residence, murder, torture, unlawful imprisonment, and other severe deprivation of physical liberty, persecution of Palestinians because of their opposition to apartheid. Israeli politicians have openly described the Palestinian population as a demographic threat, and have gone about trying to limit the democratic capability of the Palestinian people by only allowing those that reside in Israel and who are actually approved to gain citizenship and vote. These laws do not apply to Jews living in the West Bank. In order to sustain Jewish control, they also try to limit the number of Arabs in Israel and between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, as well as limiting the freedom of movement, as well as openly calling for the Judaization of areas with significant Arab populations. This is all done in order to boost the Jewish population and power across the territories. Israeli authorities have also barred granting long-term legal status to Palestinians inside Israel who marry Israeli citizens. However, citizens from virtually any non-Arab country can be granted that status. Under Israeli law, a Jewish citizen of any other country who has never been to Israel can move there and automatically gain citizenship, while Palestinians expelled from their homes in what became Israel and living for more than 75 years in refugee camps in Gaza, of whom the majority's population are descendants of refugees, or nearby country, cannot. In 2004, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, the ACRI, released a report finding that the Israeli Interior Ministry's population registry systemically denies applications by Palestinians and other non-Jews for residency, family reunification, or granting status to children, quote, only because they are non-Jews, whilst actively seeking to boost Jewish immigration to Israel. Palestinians can be classified into one of four scenarios in the context of treatment by the Israeli state. Those residing in Israel or as Israeli Arab citizens, East Jerusalem, West Bank and the Gaza Strip. According to international law, East Jerusalem, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have all in fact been legally occupied by the Israeli army for 57 years. Since 1967, with all aspects of life controlled by the Israeli state, Palestinians enjoy a diminishing number of rights as you go down that order. Starting with Israel, whilst it is true that 20% of the Israeli population are Arabs, Israeli is not a nationality which is shared by citizens. Instead, the most important factor is a national category, namely either Jewish or Arab, which is how Israeli Arabs are still granted unequal treatment despite holding citizenship. This was further exacerbated with the 2018 nation-state law, which states that Israel is a nation-state of the Jewish people, with the right to self-determination granted to the Jewish people exclusively, and establishing Jewish settlement as a national value, and will labour to encourage and promote its establishment and development, whilst downgrading Arabic from its designation as an official language. There are 6.2 million Jews and 1.6 million Arabs living within Green Line Israel. The Palestinians were placed under strict military law from the creation of the State of Israel, which meant that their rights, including their freedom of movement between places and enclaves, were severely restricted compared to a Jew for the first 17 years of the occupation. They only lifted the rule in 1966 after all the Palestinians affirmed that they would not be able to return to their villages and homeland that they were expelled from. Whilst both Palestinians and Jews can achieve Israeli citizenship, Israel does not grant all of its citizens equal rights. The national groups of Jewish and Arab were even required to be present on the ID cards until 2005, allowing discrimination to foster much more easily. Israeli Supreme Court Justice Hanan Meltzer wrote in 2013 that the constitutional Jewishness of the state negates the legal possibility of recognizing an Israeli nationality, which is distinct, as it were, from the Jewish nationality. So in what ways are Arabs and Jews treated unequally under the law? To name a few examples, Jews have a far easier and quicker way of gaining citizenship compared to Arabs. Laws to do with funding and other perks are often passed that favour Jewish Israelis compared to Arab Israelis. Arab Israelis are often demonised and pressured out of the political system and often labelled as outsiders. Arab Israelis are the only ones who routinely get their citizenship stripped off. Jews are able to make their spouses Israeli citizens very easily, but Arabs face many obstacles. Arabs do not have the same rights as Jews, such as freedom of speech, assembly, or association.
انت موقفه باتهام بمشهد كلمات مديح تعاطف وتشجيع العمل الارهابي. لا استنى شوي يا عم مستحيل تعريض حيازه الاعلانات تعرض على العنف والارهاب، الكشف عن الانتماء الى منظمه ارهابيه.
Even raising the Palestinian flag, the flag of a technically sovereign nation, can land you a hefty fine or jail time. Arab Israelis go through a more difficult and humiliating prison experience too, which Jews do not face. As for land expropriation, Israel has historically seized much Arab land and handed it over to the Jewish National Fund, an organization set up blatantly to buy land for the benefit and usage of the Jewish people exclusively, excluding Arabs. Israel blatantly maintains policies to ensure the Jewish population in certain desirable areas and push Arab populations out. This leads to the fact that despite living in just 3% of the land, 97% of demolition orders were located in Palestinian towns. Arab towns and communities are constantly harassed and their lives are made more difficult purposefully in order to drive them out. Even when they act in the same way as other illegal Jewish settlers in the West Bank, the Arabs face blatant discrimination. Arabs are blocked from accessing the land they were pushed out from in 1948, even though their families might trace back centuries to that area, whereas Jewish families are paid to move in despite not having resided there for millennia. Israel passed a law in 2011 which formalized the practice of ethnic discrimination from communities. This means a settlement or town is able to reject someone moving in based off of their race alone. Arab neighborhoods tend to be specifically designed in a way to ensure that they do not expand or improve. This leads to the shocking statistic that despite making up 20% of the Israeli population, Arabs live on just 3% of the land. Being pushed into such concentrated spaces also means it is easier to economically disadvantage them, as funding for certain areas can be increased or cut on purpose, affecting just the Arab or Jewish community. The Israeli government purposefully plans Arab neighborhoods with very poor funding and few industrial zones or government buildings, which are the biggest drivers of economic growth. Arab neighborhoods also receive a fraction of the funding given to Jewish neighborhoods, especially schools. This leads to a much higher percentage of Arabs living in poverty compared to Jews in Israel due to this systemic discrimination. Only 1.7% of the COVID recovery fund was given out to Palestinian authorities. Palestinian schools are far less funded and more overcrowded with crumbling infrastructure compared to Jewish schools. The average expenditure per Arab student was $220 in 2013, compared to $1,004 for poor Jewish schools and $1,781 in wealthy Jewish areas. Haaretz newspaper reports that at the same socio-economic level, Jewish schools receive between 35 to 68% higher funding than Arab Israeli schools. This all results in a wage gap of 31% between Jewish and Arab women and 44.6% between Jewish and Arab men. Whilst 47.4% of Palestinians work in unskilled labour and construction, over half of Arab Israelis are living below the poverty line. Arabs own just 3% of Israeli land despite making up 20% of the population. Whilst all of that seems bad enough already and warrants with labelling Israel an apartheid state according to these human rights organisations, the persecution of the Palestinians gets worse when you factor in other occupied territories, such as with East Jerusalem. After seizing the entire West Bank in 1967, Israel annexed 72 square kilometers of land, including the eastern part of Jerusalem and land that belonged to 28 surrounding West Bank villages. The USA is the only nation in the world to recognize these annexations as legal, with recognition from President Donald Trump in 2017. East Jerusalem, which Israel considers part of its sovereign territory, remains occupied territory under international law. Israel provides the vast majority of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living there with a legal status that weakens their residency rights by conditioning them on the individual's connection to the city, among other factors. According to Human Rights Watch, this level of discrimination amounts to systemic oppression. The city is made up of around 380,000 Palestinians and 565,000 Jewish Israelis, including over 220,000 settlers in occupied East Jerusalem. The Israeli government has on many occasions explicitly outlined their desires for increasing the Jewish population in Jerusalem. In order to maintain and increase the Jewish population and mitigate the effects of the Arab population, Palestinians face a much harder way of living and remaining in East Jerusalem compared to Jews. Jewish officials have said before that they intended to ensure that the welfare and quality of Jewish residents is always the best, and that they will do everything they can to ensure that the Palestinians receive nothing in order to ensure that their quality of life is worse and drive them out. I'm looking after the Jewish majority. That is why we are here, to take care of that. Like all of us here, it seems to me, I am worried about the balance of power and Arab growth within and around Jerusalem. For Jewish Jerusalem, I did something in the past 25 years. For East Jerusalem, nothing. What did I do? Nothing. Sidewalks? Nothing. Cultural institutions? Not one. Yes, we installed a sewage system for them and improved the water supply. Do you know why? Do you think it was for their good, for their welfare? Forget it. There were some cases of cholera there, and the Jews were afraid that they would catch it, so we installed sewage and a water system against cholera. As for land expropriation, 1/3 of East Jerusalem's land has been expropriated from Palestinians in order to build settlements for Jews. Land registration is frozen for Palestinians since 1967, but not for Jews. This means Arabs are likely to get their land confiscated as it is not registered, but the Israeli government has also ensured it is literally impossible to do so only for Arabs, not for Jews. Absentee land owned by Arabs can be taken over and owned by Jews only. However, Jewish land in the same context is never up for grabs, especially not by Arabs. Building permits are given almost exclusively to Jewish settlers, whilst Palestinians are barred. This means that home demolitions are almost entirely exclusive to Arabs, not Jews, even when Jews break building violations. Palestinians are afforded inferior status compared to Jews, despite being born and bred there, sometimes with roots leading back centuries. Citizenship is far more difficult to obtain for Arabs than Jews, and when looking at those whose citizenship has been revoked, we see it is Palestinians exclusively. Policing also results in violence against Palestinians, provoking from the police, as well as discriminatory arrests and setups. Despite being 40% of the population, Arabs make up 77% of children arrests. Haaretz newspaper has described the policy of near-daily raids, patrols, checkpoints and ambushes in the neighbourhood of Isawiyah as a form of collective punishment, and found that only a tiny fraction of those arrested have been charged with stone throwing or other offences. The separation barrier also ensures that only Palestinians go through a very difficult and unnecessarily bureaucratic procedure just to live day to day. However, these checkpoints only negatively affect Arabs, not Jews, as they are allowed free access with very smooth stops at the checkpoints, whilst Arabs are delayed, turned back for no reason, and humiliated with procedures like stop and search, strip searches, and arrests. Just as with Israeli Arab and Jewish neighbourhoods and infrastructure, Arab neighbourhoods in East Jerusalem still receive vastly lower funding than Jewish schools. They receive a fraction of Jewish funding in the Jerusalem municipality's budget, receiving only about 10% of the budget despite being 40% of the population. Israeli human rights group Ir Amim estimates that the classroom shortage in Jerusalem will be confined to the Arab sector alone. Palestinian neighbourhoods had 3 playgrounds to serve a combined population of 60,000, whilst nearby Jewish playgrounds had a playground for every 1,000 residents. This results in 72% of Palestinian families living below the poverty line, compared to just 26% of Jewish families, and many other indicators of deliberate poorer quality and funding. Despite this, the Israeli government provides just 6 welfare officers in Palestinian neighbourhoods, but 19 in Jewish ones. 32% of Palestinian students do not complete 12 years of education, compared to 1.5% of Jewish students. Moving on to the West Bank. According to Human Rights Watch, since they seized the West Bank on June 7, 1967, Israeli authorities have ruled over the entire territory. That day, the army issued a proclamation establishing that its West Bank area commander has all legislative, executive and judicial powers over the occupied territory. Since then, the army has issued hundreds of military orders governing many aspects of everyday life, including regulating freedom of movement and access to land and natural resources, except for in East Jerusalem, which Israel unilaterally annexed in 1967 and has governed under its civil law. For all intensive purposes, the West Bank is completely controlled, occupied, and settled by Israel. Israeli settlement authorities have confiscated over 2 million dunams of land, comprising a third of all West Bank land, all for the exclusive use of Jewish settlements which are deemed illegal under international law, with a further 1.4 million dunams or a quarter of West Bank land as Israeli state land. The West Bank is divided into 165 disconnected enclaves for Palestinians, with roadblocks, checkpoints, settlements, barriers, and walls in between disconnecting them. Israel controls all the water, trade, energy, electricity, resources, the population registry and official documentation, the airspace and border checkpoints, even the electromagnetic spectrum. Israel effectively divides Palestinians in the West Bank into 3 enclaves, one in the north from Jenin to Ramallah, one in the south including Hebron and Bethlehem, and one in the east around Jericho. As per the Oslo Accord in 1994, the West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C, and created the Palestinian Authority, the PA, to give a legitimate authoritative body to the Palestinians in the West Bank. Israeli authorities have exclusive control over Area C, comprising about 60% of the West Bank. The PA has managed some affairs in areas A and B, which comprise the remaining 40%, namely education, healthcare, and other civil affairs. Area A is where the PA has more authority, and is where you will find the typical Palestinian population centers such as Jenin, Ramallah, and Jericho, whereas Area B is officially the shared regions. Israeli authorities, however, greatly restrict its powers even in areas A and B, and retain primary control across the West Bank over many aspects of the lives of Palestinians, including over borders, control of natural resources, airspace, movement of people and goods, security, and the population registry.
This is Fadl, who has lived in this home his whole life. In the 1980s, Israel set up this checkpoint in front of his house. Fadl now has to check in every time he leaves or enters his own home. كيف بتضايقوا عليكم؟
زي ما انت شايفه بخلوش قرايبنا يجوا علينا.
خطرة.
يعني بنتي متجوزه هي مسموح لها تيجي جوزها لا.
واو، وهلا لما بتمرق ايش لازم تفرجيه؟
اسمه ورقم هويتي.
وانت بتقدر تمشي
لا.
هون مش ممنوع؟
بس لحديتهم.
واو.
هون ممنوع.
Every birth an individual in the West Bank must be registered onto the Israeli population registry in order to keep track of and are given Israeli ID numbers and cards. Even within the West Bank, Israel retains control of roads, water, electricity, healthcare, and other services. Even where Palestinians maintain a degree of autonomy within their enclaves, they rely on infrastructure projects including roads, electricity towers, and water and sewage pipes that require Israeli-issued permits or that cross through Israeli-controlled Area C. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that they have no intention of giving up control over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and described the Palestinians as subjects, not citizens. In terms of land expropriation, of the 675,000 dunams of state land the Israeli government has officially allocated for third parties in the West Bank, 99.76% is earmarked for the use of Israeli civilians. Authorities allocated the majority of the state land, 400,000 dunams in total, to the World Zionist Organization, whose mission is defined as to establish and strengthen Jewish settlement in the country's periphery through strengthening the hold on state lands given to it by the government. In other words, going to fund exclusively Jewish settlements that are built in the West Bank. Since 1967, Israeli authorities have established more than 280 settlements in the West Bank, which are exclusively Jewish. 138 they formally recognize and about 150 outposts. Settlements without formal authorization, but where authorities provide infrastructure, basic services and security, as well as 12 settlements in East Jerusalem and several settlement enclaves inside Palestinian neighborhoods in parts of East Jerusalem and Hebron. Authorities have done so in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention's prohibition against the transfer of an occupying power's civilian population to occupied territory. Israeli authorities bar Palestinians in the West Bank from entering settlements except as laborers bearing special permits. In a quick case study, Faris Addiq and his family owns a 4.5 dunam plot of land in the nearby village of Kufr Addiq. It slowly began being surrounded on 3 sides by settlements until the Israeli authorities closed down the agricultural road that led to his plot of land without notice or explanation. They said if he wanted to access it, he'd have to build a road at his own expense. After he had done so with a significant investment of his own money, they sealed that one off too with a gate. They forced him to walk uphill for almost a kilometre to reach his own plot of land. Settlers, however, are regularly allowed into his land, with them trespassing often to go swim in the natural pools there, and act very confrontational. In 2019, they also uprooted a bunch of their fig and olive trees. The Israeli authorities have not arrested anyone or brought anyone to account.
The Palestinian olive harvest is a sacred ritual, cherished by Palestinians from all walks of life. But every year, the beauty of the olive harvest is inevitably marred by violence and bloodshed, as Israeli settlers wage vicious attacks against Palestinian farmers across the occupied West Bank.
We're in the middle of the Nablus district in the northern occupied West Bank. It's home to dozens of rural Palestinian villages like this one, most of which are surrounded by a number of illegal Israeli settlements. The Israeli settlers in the Nablus district are notoriously violent and are routinely recorded as attacking Palestinians and their property year-round. But once the olive harvest comes around every year, the Israeli settlers typically focus their attacks onto Palestinian farmers and their olive trees.
المستوطنين بيراقبوا المزارع لما بيكون لوحده او هيك بيراقبوه وبيجوا بيسرقوا المحصول تبعه، فهنا قمة المأساة انه طول السنة المزارع وهو يحاول يجهز الثمار ويسقي الشجر ويكن بالشجر ويعمل كل هاي الجهود، وفي الاخير بيجي مستوطن بكل اريحية بيحمل شوال الزيتون وبهرب فيه باتجاه المستوطن وبكون مسلح وبكون محمي من الجيش. بدنا ندافع عن كل ذرة تراب في هاي الجبال. هاي الزيتونة احنا رح نصلها ورح نصل لكل الزيتون الفلسطيني ونقطف كل حبة زيت ونعطيها للمزارع. رح ندافع عن حالنا ما أوتينا بالقوة، جاهزين لدفع الثمن. يعني دفع الثمن بالنسبة لنا كشعب فلسطيني احنا جاهزين له، سواء اعتقال، سواء إرصاص، سواء قنابل غاز، سواء كل وسائل القمع والدمار والإرهاب احنا تعودنا عليها.
Just days after the olive harvest began this year, the group was called to the site of a violent attack on a group of Palestinian farmers in a nearby town.
طبعا بداية كانوا 20 صاروا 30 صاروا 40 والجيش الاحتلال أطلقوا النار علي، أطلقوا قنابل غاز، أطلقوا صوتيات علينا. ليش من كل الجيش تخليش المستوطنين يضربوا حجار؟ ليه يضربوا حجار علينا؟ الحجر أكثر من 6 كيلو اللي كانوا يضربوا فيه وأنا على الأرض. عندي إصابة هان، عندي إصابة في رجلي، عندي إصابة في كوعي، عندي في إيدي، عندي في ظهري، عندي في راسي. تهمتي الوحيدة إني أنا بدي أروح على أرضي، أرض أبوي، أرض جدي اللي زرعوها.
More often than not, the settlers are armed and operate under the full protection of the Israeli military.
والجيش الإسرائيلي مع الأسف الاحتلال هو بيعطيهم الضوء الأخضر إنه يداهمونا ويضربونا ويكسرونا حتى توصل للوفاة. أنا البارح اعتدوا علي، يعني الله سبحانه وتعالى أنقذني من بينهم ولا كان قتل. إحنا مش مجرمين، إحنا تهمتنا إنه بدنا نروح نخرج زيتون لأولادنا. هاي الحال اللي بصير يوميا في فلسطين بكل أراضي الشعب الفلسطيني.
An average of 18 structures were demolished every week in 2020. In the same year, Israel issued 1,094 building permits for Jewish settlers, but only 1 for Palestinians. For the 20-year period between 2000 and 2019, Israeli authorities approved only 245 building permits for Palestinians in Area C, less than 4% of the number of applications submitted. They issued 21 permits between 2016 and 2018, less than 1.5% of the applications submitted. Between 2009 and 2020, Israeli authorities demolished 5,817 Palestinian-owned structures, including homes, in the West Bank, mostly for lacking a permit, leaving 6,500 Palestinians displaced. By contrast, Israeli authorities offer a range of incentives, including housing benefits, business subsidies, particularly in agricultural and industrial zones, budgetary perks, and tax breaks to encourage Jewish Israelis to move to settlements. According to Peace Now, between 2009 and 2020, Israeli authorities began construction of more than 23,696 units in West Bank settlements. The system of domination continues with the slow colonization of the land, pushing the native Palestinians out of areas of West Bank control. As for discriminatory treatment, according to Human Rights Watch, for the past 54 years, Israeli authorities have facilitated the transfer of Jewish Israelis to the occupied Palestinian territories and granted them a superior status under the law, as compared to Palestinians living in the same territory when it comes to civil rights, access to land, and freedom to move, build, and confer residency rights to close relatives. Whilst Palestinians have a limited degree of self-rule in part of the occupied territories, Israel retains primary control over borders, airspace, the movement of people and goods, security, and the registry of the entire population, which in turn dictates such matters as legal status and eligibility to receive identity cards. Palestinians are again afforded inferior status in the West Bank compared to Jewish settlers, who are illegal under international law. Jews are also pretty much always afforded this status, whereas as a Palestinian it is far more difficult, even if both follow the same procedure. Just as with East Jerusalem, the land registry has been frozen since 1967 for Arabs but not for Jews. Arabs are tried under strict military law, whereas Jews are tried under Israeli civil law. Arabs are extradited from the West Bank to Israel for their prison sentences, which yet again breaks international law. The authorities also treat the two population groups unequally on a range of issues, including the protection of civil and political rights, methods of law enforcement, freedom of movement, freedom to build, and access to water, electricity, infrastructure, and other resources and services. Settlers are afforded a much more open set of rights, such as freedom of speech, assembly, or a requirement for a warrant to be arrested. Even the conditions in where Arabs are arrested are inferior to Jews. Even the laws governing children also push discrimination against Arab children. Arrests on Arab children are often made in the middle of the night, which are illegal to do against Jewish children. 3/4 of them experience a violent arrest, including being slapped, kicked, punched, and struck with rifles. They get blindfolded and shackled, experience physical and mental abuse, and don't even have access to parents or attorneys. This is legal to do to Arab children, but not Jewish children. The hearing is done in Hebrew, which of course the Arab children don't understand, and they are often forced to sign and agree to documents that they don't understand, leading to a staggering 99% conviction rate. This is all referring to children, and the most common conviction is stone throwing. There are 700 children jailed a year, often being kept in solitary confinement. This is how children are treated in the West Bank. Adults get treated even worse. Jewish inmates get treated far better than Arab inmates. Thousands of complaints and lawsuits of torture are made, but are often thrown out before even being read. As for permission to build, move between enclaves, set up businesses, or anything else, permits are required for most actions or activities for Palestinians. According to Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, Arabs face an arbitrary, entirely non-transparent bureaucratic system with no way of assessing the chances that their applications will be approved or how soon. This system does not exist for Jews. There are areas which prevent Arabs from entering, but not Jews, leading to the creation of the notoriously named Apartheid Wall, which separates people based off of their ethnicity. There are even entire roads which prevent Palestinians from accessing, but not Jews, which the army has spoken of making sterile of Palestinians. Israel continues to confiscate and separate Arab land, especially farms, which leads to them giving up a lot of the time. Many stories exist of farmers, such as Ferdis mentioned earlier, who gave up after settlers would keep harassing them, damaging their private land, or being blocked from accessing it by the army, and when they appeal to the courts, they get ignored. Israeli forces often kill Palestinians and use excess force, even in areas where it does not grant itself the authority to patrol security, such as Area A. Jews remain immune when the victim is Arab, and police close the overwhelming majority of complaints, and sometimes even join in on the violence. Israel has killed 4,868 Palestinians, of whom 1,793 are children, outside of armed conflict between 2000 and 2017.
Are also in place to protect Israeli settlers, and the ones in Hebron are known for being among the most violent in all of the occupied West Bank. This is kind of a common sight here in the Old City. There's a Palestinian family that lives at the end of this alleyway. Above them is an Israeli settlement, and because the settlers throw garbage down at them, they have to put these nets here to protect them.
يعني هون لما اجوا يعتقلوني هون بالضبط يعتقلوني.
كنتي هون بالضبط؟
كنت بالضبط هون. لما اجوا يعتقلوني بالضبط هون كنت.
The family at the end of the alley is the Sidrs. Just a few weeks before I arrived to Hebron, nearby settlers accused their 13-year-old daughter Selwa of picking a knife up off the ground.
فقد كل جيبتي معيش ولا سكينة أنا.
أول شيء لهم هذا. أقول ده أنا أخشبه كذا. يتيجي. أنا تبي زيكون ممنوع.
اعتقلوني وأخذوني على مدرسة أسامة وقعدوا يحققوا معي. قعدت ساعة لما حققوا معي. لما فلتوني قعدت ساعة لما فلتوني يعني كثير ساعات لما فلتوني وحققوا معي.
بتخافي يعتقلوكي كمان مرة؟
أنا حسيت إنه وأنا نايمة حسيت إنه بدهم يعتقلوني بنص.
يا لما أجي أعتقل بنتي أعطالي درس الاحتلال، أعطالي إياه إذا أنت ضابط إسرائيلي بتتعامل مع البنتك شو بدك يكون بينه وبينك السلام.
Amnesty International reports that no Israeli soldier has ever been convicted for the death of a Palestinian since 1987. As for natural resources, Israel retains control over the West Bank aquifers and distributes water very unequally, despite the aquifers originating and being collected in the West Bank.
I can't wash my hair because of the Israeli occupation. All of our tanks are out of water. We only get water every 15 to 20 days. hence the tanks. And if you're out of luck until the next refill. These water tanks are a staple on Palestinian houses in the West Bank to combat the chronic water shortage. But the problem isn't that there's not enough water. The problem is even our water sources are under occupation, and it's all controlled by the Israeli government and private Israeli corporations, who allot Palestinians less water than the World Health Organization recommends. But why? What are they doing with all our water? Funneling it into neighboring illegal settlements, where Israelis have a continuous supply of water and consume more than double their Palestinian neighbors. And to top it off, the Israeli company that supplies Palestinians in Bethlehem and Hebron with 70% of our water is reducing that amount even more.
The Palestinian Authority should also have a say when it comes to water distribution, according to the Oslo Accords, which created the Joint Water Committee, but Israel still refuses to hand over authority to it, in violation of the Oslo Accords it signed. Israel has denied Palestinians the right to drill any new wells, so the levels of water extraction has not increased, but the population has been increasing for decades. This means that Palestinians rely on purchasing water, which has been extracted from their own land at very large markups, which makes up almost half of all water consumed by Palestinians in the West Bank. Many Arab neighborhoods also are provided with very poor infrastructure, which along with the restrictive levels of water provided leads to Arabs growing less water-intensive crops. These restrictions all do not apply to Jewish settlers, which results in them consuming 4 times as much water as Arabs do. Sewage also flows out of Jewish settlements and into the residential areas and water sources of Palestinian areas, and has done so since the mid-1990s, B'Tselem reports in 2009 and Human Rights Watch. UNICEF and the Palestinian Hydrology Group also report in 2011 of areas that are notorious for flushing its leftover chemical waste onto Southwood villages, including petrochemicals, metals and plastics. The World Bank estimates in 2013 that discriminatory Israeli restrictions in Area C cost the Palestinian economy $3.4 billion a year.
Thousands of other Palestinians in Hebron are also forced to pass military checkpoints just to go home. The military also bans Palestinians from using certain streets, as Ori shows me.
On that street over there, Palestinians are allowed to walk and open businesses, but not allowed to drive. The yellow street on the map is a street where Palestinians are only allowed to walk, not allowed to drive, and not allowed to open businesses. The streets that we're heading towards are mostly sterile, meaning that no Palestinian in the whole wide world can walk on those streets. If you do one step over here, no Palestinians are allowed here. If we take one step here, here Palestinians are allowed. And I don't know any other word to call this than apartheid.
Omer Bartov, an Israeli-born Holocaust historian at Brown University, said of the policies in the West Bank, "Anyone who observes the reality on the ground can have no doubt about the nature of this regime, whereby 3 million Palestinians live under one set of laws, and 500,000 Jewish settlers live under another set of laws."
I say this as an American Jew. My children go to Jewish day school. I lead services in an Orthodox synagogue. Judaism is the center of my life. The first time I went to spend time with Palestinians in the West Bank, it was a shattering experience. The only thing I could imagine would be similar for American would be going to visit the Jim Crow South. When you see people living under the control of the state with no rights, they cannot become citizens. They cannot vote for the state that controls their lives. They do not have free movement. They need a pass to move from city to city. They live under a military legal system. The consequences are more brutal than we can imagine sitting here. People need to go and see for themselves. I've never seen anyone who's gone and seen for themselves and not been transformed by the experience.
The most stark thing I could say to try and illustrate this is that the poorest Israeli Jewish settlement in the West Bank enjoys more political, more economic and more legal rights than the best and most well-off Palestinian communities living right beside them. And that is probably the starkest and most visible example of how this huge differentiation of rights favours Israeli Jews and disadvantages Palestinian Arabs. Now we move on to the worst case yet, Gaza. The Gaza Strip holds 2.3 million residents who comprise a strip that is just 6 kilometers wide in some parts and 41 kilometers long, resulting in a population density that is 13 times higher than Israel's. Israeli authorities have exerted control over the strip since occupying it in 1967 and recognizes both Gaza and the West Bank as part of one single territorial unit, as part of the 1995 Oslo Accords. In 2005, Israel withdrew their ground troops and settler population and reduced its ground control. It then declared Gaza hostile territory and tightened movement restrictions, imposing a generalized ban on travel to the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories or abroad, pretty much irrespective of any individualized risk assessment for a particular person blocking medical care, educational, and economic opportunities from those Palestinians, whereas Jewish settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories, both before the expulsion and after, do not face any of these restrictions and can travel freely between Israel, the West Bank settlements, and East and West Jerusalem. This strip the size of East London is seen as occupied by Human Rights Watch, the International Committee for the Red Cross, B'Tselem, the United Nations, and even Israel's leading expert on international law, Yoram Denstein of Tel Aviv University. Israel still retains control of air, sea, and land exit and entry points, which has led to them implementing what the United Nations calls a medieval blockade. They've bombed all of their existing airport and seaport infrastructure, effectively landlocking the strip. Israel also controls the flow of both people and goods in and out and maintains a policy of separation between the West Bank and the Strip, despite viewing them legally as one territorial unit. They also set the value of VAT and custom exchange rates inside of the Strip. Between January 2015 and December 2019, an average of 373 Palestinians exited every day via the Erez crossing. Just 1.5% of the value before the blockade in 2000, of 26,000 per day. Israel controls the electricity lines, underwater phone cables, internet cables, and phone frequencies that Gazans use. Israel has also banned the entry of most civilian goods such as chocolate, coriander, and paper, and severely limited the access to basic services such as electricity and water. Israel also severely restricts the flow of exports, with only 14 truckloads per month of goods permitted to exit between June 2007 and October 2014, with the number going up to 219 per month between 2016 and 19. This is still just 20% of the amount Gaza used to export prior to the blockade being implemented in 2007. They've also shut down exports for punitive reasons, creating a captive market, where they are not allowed to create or export any of their own fruits, vegetables, construction equipment or materials, fertilizers, and much more. Instead, they are forced to import from Israeli producers. This results in over 80% of Gaza's imports coming from Israel, over $600 million worth, with just one Israeli cement company being contracted for almost all of the cement in Gaza.
Have you ever heard about the only Palestinian mushroom farm?
No.
It's called the Amuru Mushroom Farm. It was 10 years ago, there was no mushrooms other than Israeli mushroom. And there was no Palestinian, only Israeli mushrooms. And then a group of Palestinians, and they were actually tech engineers. They didn't know anything of farm. They taught themselves how to farm. They had to revive ancient methods to collect water and to agriculture. And they started to actually do this mushroom farms, and they from one farm they had more than 30 or 40% of the market. So what did the Israelis do? They started to hold their spore shipments from the Netherlands, the one that they used to plant them, in their ports in the Ashdod port, and they would put them for month and month and month and month, crippling the business. So there's a ways of occupation other than there's the brutality, there's the killing, there's the taking of the land, but there's other ways. They are destroying the land. They are removing any kind of hope for those people to be in the land.
This therefore means that under international law, Israel still remains as the occupier of the Gaza Strip, even internationally by nations such as the United Kingdom or the collective of the European Union, and required to provide them with a basic minimum standard of living and the minimum rights and protections afforded to them by the law of occupation under the ICRC and the UN. They have consistently failed to meet these requirements. We therefore look at apartheid by Israel to the Palestinians in light of treatment of Gazans too, as they are under their occupation. According to Human Rights Watch, viewed in that light, the severe repression of Palestinians stands in marked contrast to the treatment of Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israeli authorities deny Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories basic rights and services that they provide Israeli settlers living in the same legal territory, including freedom of movement, the right to live with or visit loved ones living in that territory, and access to 24-hour electricity and clean water. Israeli officials in 2008 calculated the minimum number of calories that are required to starve, but just enough to avoid a humanitarian crisis. And many politicians joked about putting the Gazans on a diet. Israeli officials said at the time that they wanted to keep Gaza's economy on the brink of collapse whilst avoiding humanitarian crisis. The OCHA has said that these restrictions impede the delivery of humanitarian assistance, basic services and reconstruction programs, and undermine the response capacity for emergencies. Gaza's only power plant keeps getting bombed out of usage, so now they have to rely on Israel for all of their electricity needs. The Israeli electric company sells them far lower quantities than they need, however, and periodically reduces supply. Jewish settlers in all of the occupied territories have access to 24/7 electricity. In terms of legal discrimination, Arabs get assigned an inferior legal status to Jews. Even when the Israeli army had a physical presence inside of the strip, Arabs were institutionally treated as inferior compared to Jews, as has happened with the West Bank. They continue to be denied access to their historic homeland. They are subject to routine strike-offs from the birth registry, which they are required to sign every birth and death to, but is controlled by Israel. These penalties do not apply to Jewish Israelis, though. A survey in 2005 conducted by B'Tselem estimated that more than 640,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza had a parent, sibling, child, or spouse who was unregistered, even though 78.4% of them had filed a family reunification request that had not yet been processed. Since 2000, Israeli authorities have, for the most part, refused to update the population registry or process applications for residency by unregistered Palestinians, their spouses, and close relatives, even if they had lived in the West Bank or Gaza for years and had families, homes, jobs, or other ties there, and even froze the family reunification process entirely, which is used by Palestinians to apply for legal status to join immediate relatives or spouses not registered. Israel also often uses vastly disproportional amounts of violence against Arab civilians, at times deliberately targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure. It has, in total, killed well over 2,000 civilians since 2007. Palestinian armed groups also committed war crimes, claims Human Rights Watch, but the Israeli response was both far more disproportional and also deliberately targeted civilian centers. The current alternate Prime Minister and former Defense Minister, Benjamin Gantz, bragged in 2019 that he had sent parts of Gaza back to the Stone Age. Israeli authorities have for years consistently failed to investigate unlawful attacks and to hold those responsible to account, according to Human Rights Watch.
People always say, why don't the Palestinians, why don't they have a Gandhi? Why don't they try nonviolence? Well, guess what? They tried nonviolence. They tried it. 214 people in Gaza, including 46 children, were killed during the Great March of Return, a large-scale peaceful protest along the separation fence between Gaza and Israel.
This all stems from a decades-long pattern, which follows that Israeli military forces use disproportionate violence which tends to largely affect civilians. According to Human Rights Watch, Israeli authorities have often justified these tactics in the name of protecting Israeli communities on the other side of the Gaza fence from the possibility of harm, but without justifying the force used under the imminent threat test. Despite Gaza's population density being 13 times higher than Israel's, Israel still creates a buffer zone inside of Gaza and routinely shoots civilians who get close, with 161 civilians killed and 3,000 injured between 2000 and 2017. Israeli authorities also regularly spray herbicides along the eastern fences to remove vegetation, causing extensive damage to crops in the most arable land in all of Gaza, causing financial loss for farmers and impairing the health of people living in the area. All of these restrictions and use of excess force is never applied to Jewish Israelis, however is done to Arabs with legal and diplomatic impunity. Israeli authorities unofficially and indirectly acknowledge the different tiers of rights and quality of life they afford to Palestinians. They try to facilitate the move of Palestinians from Israel to East Jerusalem, to the West Bank, and all the way to the Strip, and make any of those steps very easy to carry out, but make it virtually impossible to do the other way around, creating a one-way permit demotion down the scale. Between 2009 and 2017, Israel approved just 6 applications for movement from Gaza to reside in the West Bank. 4 of the 6 cases involved children who had no one to care for them in Gaza, and every time it needed to reach the Israeli Supreme Court. However, between 2011 and 2014, Israel approved 58 applications for relocation from the West Bank to the Strip on the condition that they sign a pledge that they should never return to the West Bank. No such agreement is required for the other way around. They also removed 130 Gazans living in the West Bank between 2004 and 2017, but none in the other direction. Israel varies how much it permits Palestinians to access of their own coastline, mostly left at 6 nautical miles. This leads to the destruction of the fishing industry, with numbers less than halving and most of them living below the poverty line. They also have limited access to clean water, with 96% of Gazan water being seen as unfit for human consumption, which is the cause for 26% of all illnesses and the leading cause of child mortality. Water, therefore, needs to be imported, but the water supplies is of much lower quality and supplied through terrible infrastructure. Desalination does occur, but requires significant electricity, fuel, and funding, all of which are severely restricted by the Israeli authorities. At its highest in 2019, the average resident of Gaza survived on just 79 litres of water a day, compared to between 137 to 247 for Jewish Israelis. These restrictions have devastated Gaza's economy. GDP per capita in Gaza dropped 23% between 1994 and 2016 in real dollars. 80% of Gaza's population relies on humanitarian aid, according to the UNRWA, UNRWA, and more than half the population lives below the poverty line. unemployment rates in Gaza have for some time hovered around 50% and are higher for young people and women. Now, Israel would often legitimize their actions to the Palestinians by citing security concerns, especially after the Second Intifada between 2000 and 2005. Human Rights Watch states, however, that generally human rights experts take issue with the idea that many of the policies Israel has imposed in the West Bank and elsewhere have a security justification. Many abuses, including categorical denials of building permits, mass residency revocations or restrictions, and large-scale land confiscations, have no legitimate security justifications. Additionally, the need for national security can be leveraged to legitimize human rights abuses. In fact, this is something that even Israeli politicians commented on. Ariel Sharon, Prime Minister in 2005, said on the renewal of the temporary law, "There's no need to hide behind security arguments. There's a need for the existence of a Jewish state." He later added that authorities had a correct and important intention of Israel being a Jewish state with a massive Jewish majority, and that we must do everything so that the state remains a Jewish state in the future. Human Rights Watch also states, Israeli authorities have also, since 1967, effectively controlled the population registry in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, recording every Palestinian birth, marriage, divorce, address change, and death. Between 1967 and 1994, they struck from it hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, as Human Rights Watch has documented. The Israeli army has used residency status to control the ability of Palestinians to reside in, move within, and travel abroad from the West Bank, as well as to travel from Gaza to Israel and the West Bank. These restrictions are implemented in such a sweeping fashion that it is difficult to see them as motivated primarily by security, rather than demographic considerations. To really come to a final conclusion of whether or not Israel practices apartheid, we need to look back and see if all of the pillars have been met, according to the United Nations definition. 1. An intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another. Well, by the many quotes of Israeli politicians talking about how the right to self-determination is for Jews exclusively, talking of the necessity of a Jewish state, not a state of all of its citizens, talking about how they need to maximize the number of Jews and minimize the number of Palestinians, referring to the Palestinians as a demographic ticking bomb, talking about how Israel needs to Judaize the Negev and Galilee, along with all of the laws passed that have been mentioned that seek to push Jewish domination over Arab. This condition has therefore been met, according to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, the United Nations, along with many legal scholars. 2. A context of systemic oppression by the dominant group over the marginalized group. Systemic oppression has been shown to exist in every geographical location: Israel, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, or the Gaza Strip. As to quote the Human Rights Watch report, we also found that Israeli authorities maintain a two-tiered legal system, methodically privileging Israelis, who have the same rights and privileges wherever they live, while repressing Palestinians to varying degrees wherever they live. Many examples have been provided in each section. 3. Inhumane acts such as forcible transfer, expropriation of landed property, and creation of separate reserves and ghettos. Whilst much can be said about the list of inhumane acts that the Israeli authorities subject the Palestinians to, there are too many to list one by one, so I'll be playing them out on the screen instead. Even the cited examples by the United Nations criteria have been met. Human Rights Watch goes further and lists the following set of inhumane actions imposed by the Israeli states on Arabs but not Jews. As a quick side note, if you are finding this video beneficial, a subscribe would be very helpful.
But the one thing that has always struck me is the extent of the brutality of Israeli apartheid goes many levels beyond what happened in South Africa. Yes, there were appalling massacres. You know, Sharpeville in 1960, Soweto in 1976, Boipatong in 1989, where I actually tried to act as a facilitator of a reconciliation process after a terrible massacre of ANC supporters by state-sponsored militias. But nothing like we've seen in the occupied territories, in both Gaza and the West Bank. And, you know, I had this view where you would see what was effectively high-level warfare against the Palestinian people in already appalling and restrictive conditions that they lived in the occupied territories. And this, for me, takes Israeli apartheid to a level of brutality that we never experienced in South Africa. Of course.
If this matter still seems unsure to you, there are a flurry of well-respected academics, diplomats, scholars, and politicians who have also given their own opinion about the question of Israeli apartheid, including Jewish Israeli prime ministers and presidents. Many other quotes can be brought about, including former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who lived through the South African apartheid period. South African Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor and former Israeli Attorney General Michael Benyer have also all called the system apartheid, along with many, many other scholars. The Special Rapporteur said the international community bears much responsibility for this present state of affairs. He says, for more than 40 years, the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly has stated in hundreds of resolutions that Israel's annexation of occupied territory is unlawful, its construction of hundreds of Jewish settlements are illegal, and its denial of Palestinian self-determination breaches international law.
But the fact is, you will never accept a two-state solution, because as far as you are concerned, ideologically, all of the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River belongs irrevocably to Israel.
Well, first of all,
do you believe that, yes or no?
First of all, it does. I mean, this land has been ours for thousands of years.
The Council and the Assembly have repeatedly criticized Israel for defying their resolutions. They have threatened consequences, but no accountability has ever followed. If the international community had truly acted on its resolutions 40 or 30 years ago, we would not be talking about apartheid today. As Haggai El-Ad, the former director of B'Tselem, wrote, there is not a single square inch in the territory Israel controls where a Palestinian and a Jew are equal.